Okay, we're back for our final chapter of Mr. Popper's Penguins. Remember, Mr. Popper and the Penguins had to go to jail because they went to the wrong theater and made everything a mess. They didn't have any money to get out of the jail, so he was waiting and waiting and waiting, and the Penguins were getting sicker. And then Admiral Drake, the explorer from Antarctica, the one who gave Mr. Popper the very first penguin, Captain Cook, he came and got him out of jail. And now he has given him something to think about. He has asked Mr. Popper to take his penguins up to the North Pole to have a new colony of penguins that has never ever been in the North Pole before. There aren't penguins at the North Pole. So he wants Mr. Popper to send his penguins to the North Pole. But Mr. Greenbaum came and said that there's a man who wants to put Mr. Popper and his penguins in the movies, and that would give him a lot of money. So he could become famous for having his penguins in the North Pole, and he wouldn't get any money. Or he could put his penguins in the movies and get a lot of money, and he would never have to worry about working again. So he has a big decision to make. So this is chapter 20, the last chapter. Chapter 20, Farewell, Mr. Popper. It was a hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what was best for everyone. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers. She pointed these things out without trying to influence him. I feel that the penguins are really your responsibility, she said, and you must make up your mind. It was a pale and haggard Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision the next day. Mr. Klein, he said, I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds in the movies. But I'm afraid that I have to refuse. I do not believe that the Hollywood life would be good for the penguins. Then he turned to Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake, I am giving to you my birds. In doing this, I am considering what is best for the birds most of all. I know that they have been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and the warm weather, I've been worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I have to do what is best for them. After all, they belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help being sorry for those men up in the North Pole without penguins to help them pass the time. Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper, said Admiral Drake. Congratulations, Admiral, said Mr. Klein. Maybe you're right at that, Popper. Hollywood might have been too much for the birds. I wish you'd let me make one short little movie here in New York, though, before they go. Just some pictures and the sort of things they do on stage, you know. We'll show the film everywhere with an announcement that these will be the famous Popper penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Foundation and Expedition, or something like that. I'd like that very much, said Mr. Popper. Well, we'll pay you, of course, continued Mr. Klein. Not a fortune, but we will pay you what we can. I'll have the contract written up. How about, let's say, $25,000? Oh, we could use that, said Mrs. Popper. It will be very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper did not answer. She knew that nothing she could say would really comfort him. However, Mr. Popper, now that spring is here, a lot of people will be wanting their houses painted, so we'd better be getting back. Anyway, said Bill, we've had 10 whole weeks of vacation right in the middle of the year. Not many children in Stillwater could say that. So there's a picture of Admiral Drake in the middle. There's Mr. Popper. And there's Mr. Klein. And there's all the birds. So Admiral Drake will be taking the penguins to the North Pole. But first they're going to make a little movie. The next day, the cameraman arrived to make the picture of the penguins doing their tricks. It was arranged that the Poppers should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were being hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the voyage. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with the trip, since it was the same one that the Admiral had sailed to the North Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen Greta, too, had seen vessels just like its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took the greatest delight in watching the curious little birds in their explorations. "It looks as if this will be a pretty lively trip," they would say. "These Popper penguins certainly live up to their reputation." But at last everything was ready, and the day came when the Poppers were to go down and say goodbye. Bill and Janey all ran over to the ship and did not want to leave when it came time to draw up the gangplank. The gangplank is the walkway that they put from the land to the ship so you can get on. The Admiral shook hands with them and Mrs. Popper and thanked them for having helped to train these extraordinary penguins that were to be real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to his birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that he was doing what was best for them, too. First, he said goodbye to all the younger penguins, then to Greta, who had saved Captain Cook, and then, last of all, he leaned over and said a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made his life so different from Mr. Popper. Then he wiped his eyes, he straightened his back, and he went up onto deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. So there's Mr. Popper saying goodbye to his penguins. And he's a little sad about it, isn't he? But he's doing what's best for his birds. "Goodbye, Admiral Drake," he said. "Goodbye?" repeated the Admiral. "Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with us?" "Me? Go with you to the North Pole? Why, of course, Mr. Popper. But how could I go with you? I'm not an explorer or a scientist. I'm just a house painter." "Well, you're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you?" roared the Admiral. "Man alive, aren't those penguins the reason for the whole expedition? And who's going to see that they're all well and happy if you're not to go along? Go put on one of those fur suits and just like the rest of us, we're pulling anchor in a minute." "Mama!" shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone up the gangplank. "I'm going too! I'm going too! Admiral Drake says he needs me, Mama. Do you mind if I don't come home for a year or two?" "Oh, as to that," Mrs. Popper said, "I'll miss you very much, my dear, but we have the money we need to live on for a few years, and in winter it will be much easier to keep the house nice and tidy without you sitting around all day. I'll be getting back to Stillwater. Tomorrow's the day for the ladies' meeting of the Aid and Missionary Society, and I'll be just in time. So goodbye, my love, and good luck." "Goodbye, good luck," echoed the children, and the penguins, hearing their voices, scuttled up onto the deck and stood there alongside the Admiral and Mr. Popper. Then they solemnly lifted their little flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river towards the sea. There's The penguins and Mr. Popper waving goodbye. Mr. Popper finally got what he wanted. He wanted to be an explorer and see the world. And now he gets to go to the North Pole with his penguins and discover new things. Wasn't that good? All right. I hope you enjoyed Mr. Popper's Penguins. Bye, my friends.